it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Dr. Bird, scientific sleuth extraordinaire, goes after a sinister stealer of brains. Stolen Brains by Captain S. P. Meek. I hope, Carnes, said Dr. Bird, we get good fishing. Good fishing? Will you please tell me what you're talking about? Well, I'm talking about fishing, my friend. You seen the evening paper? No. What's that got to do with it? Dr. Bird tossed across the table a copy of the Washington Post, folded so as to bring uppermost an item on page 3. Carnes saw his picture staring at him from the center of the page. What the hell? He exclaimed as he bent over the paper. With growing astonishment, he read that Operative Carnes of the United States Secret Service had collapsed at his desk that afternoon and had been rushed to Walter Reed Hospital, where the trouble had been diagnosed as a nervous breakdown caused by overwork. There followed a guarded statement from Admiral Clay, the President's personal physician, who had been called into conference by the Army authorities. The Admiral stated that the Chief of Washington District was in no immediate danger, but that a prolonged rest was necessary. The paper gave a glowing tribute to the detective's life and work, and stated that he'd been given sick leave for an indefinite period, and that he was leaving at once for the fishing lodge of his friend, Dr. Bird of the Bureau of Standards, at Squapan Lake, Maine. Dr. Bird, the article concluded, would accompany and care for his stricken friend. Carnes laid the paper aside with a gasp. Do you know what this means? Carnes demanded. It means, Carnesy, my old friend, that the fishing at Squapan Lake should be good right now, that I feel the need of accurate information on the subject. I didn't want to go alone, so I engineered this outrage on the government and am taking you along for company. Now, for the love of God, look sick from now on until we're clear of Washington. We leave tonight. I already have our tickets and reservations, and all you have to do is collect your tackle and pack your bags for a month or two in the woods, and meet me at the Pennsy station at 6 tonight. There are some people who say there is no Santa Claus, mused Carnes. If I'd really broken down from overwork, I would probably have had my pay docked for the time I was absent. But a man with official pull in this man's government wants to go fishing and, hey, presto, the wheels move and the way's clear. Doctor, I will meet you as directed. Good enough, said Dr. Bird. Oh, by the way, Carnes, he went on as the operative opened the door, make sure to bring your pistol. Carnes whirled about at these words. Are we, going on a case? He asked. That remains to be seen, replied the doctor. At all events, bring your pistol. In answer to any questions, we are going fishing. And as a matter of fact, we are, with ourselves as bait. If you have a little time to spare this afternoon, you might drop around to the office of the Post and get them to show you all the amnesia cases they've had stories of during the past 3 months. It'll make interesting reading. No more questions now, my friend. We'll have lots of time to talk things over when we're in the Maine woods. Late the next evening, they left the Bangor and Aroostook train at Mazardis and found a Ford truck waiting for them. Over a rough trail, they were driven for 15 miles, winding up at a log cabin which the doctor announced was his. The truck deposited their belongings and jounced away, and Dr. Bird led the way to the cabin, which proved to be unlocked. He pushed open the door and entered, followed by Carnes. The operative glanced at the occupants of the cabin and stared back in surprise. Seated at a table were 2 figures. The smaller of the two had his back to the entrance, but the larger one was facing them. He rose as they entered, and Carnes rubbed his eyes and reeled weakly against the wall. Before him stood a replica of Dr. Bird. It was the same 6'2" of bone and muscle, the same beetling brows, the same craggy chin, and high forehead surmounted by a shock of unruly black hair. In face and figure, the stranger was a replica of the famous scientist. It wasn't until he glanced at their hands. Dr. Bird's hands were long and slim with tapering fingers, the hands of a thinker and an artist, despite the acid stains which disfigured them but could not hide their beauty. The hands of this double were stained, as were Dr. Bird's, but they were short and thick and indicated more the man of action than the man of thought. The second figure arose and faced them again, and Carnes received another shock. While the likeness was not so striking, there was no doubt that the second man would readily have passed for Carnes himself in a dim light or at a little distance. Dr. Bird burst into laughter at the detective's puzzled face. "Carnes," he said, "get yourself together and then shake hands with Major Trowbridge of the Coast Artillery Corps. It's been said by some people that we look like one another." "Oh, I'm glad to meet you, Major," said Carnes. "The resemblance is positively uncanny. But for your hands, I'd have trouble telling you two apart." And the Major glanced down at his own stubby fingers. "It's unfortunate, but it can't be helped," he said. "Now, Dr. Bird, this is Corporal Askins of my command. It's not as good a second to Mr. Carnes as I am to you, but you said that was less important." "The likeness is plenty good enough," replied the doctor. "He'll probably not be subjected to as close a scrutiny as you will. Hey, did you have any trouble in getting here unobserved?" "None at all, Doctor. Lieutenant Maynard found a good landing field within half a mile of here, as you said he would. He had his plane camouflaged, and it's standing by. When do you expect trouble?" "I have no idea. May come tonight, may come later. Well, personally, I hope that it comes later, so that we can get in a good few days of fishing before anything happens." What do you expect to happen, Doctor?" demanded Carnes. "Every time I've asked you anything, you told me to wait until we were in the Maine woods, and, well, here we are now. I read up everything that I could find on amnesia victims during the past 3 months, but, well, didn't throw much light on the matter to me." "How many cases did you find, Carnes?" 16. There may have been lots more, but couldn't find any others in the post records. Of course, unless the victim were a local man or someone of prominence, it wouldn't appear." "Well, you got most of them at that. So, did any points of similarity strike you as you read them?" "Well, none except that they were all prominent men and all of them mental workers of high caliber. Well, it didn't seem strange to me because, well, it's the man of high mentality who's most apt to crack." Undoubtedly. But there were some points of similarity which you missed. Hey, where did the attacks take place?" "Why, one was... Oh, shit. Doctor, I did miss something. Every case, well, as nearly as I can recall, happened at some summer camp or other resort where they were on vacation." "Correct. Oh, one other point. What time of day did they occur?" In the morning, as well as I can remember." "Well, that point didn't register." "No, they were discovered in the morning, all of them, Carnes, which means the actual loss of memory occurred during the night. More than that, every case has happened within a circle with a diameter of 300 miles. We're near the northern edge of that circle." Carnes checked through his memory rapidly. "God, you're right, Doctor," he cried. "Hey, do you think—" "I do once in a while," replied Dr. Bird dryly. "I think enough to know the futility of guesses hazarded without complete data. We're now located within the limits of the amnesia belt, and we're here to find out what happened, if anything, and not to make wild guesses about it. So, you send up the tent for us, Major?" "Yep, Doctor. About 30 yards from the cabin and hidden so well that you could pass it a dozen times a day without suspecting its existence. The gas masks and the other equipment you sent to Fort Banks are inside. In that case, we'd better dispense with your company as soon as we've eaten a bite and retire to the tent. Hey, on second thoughts, we'll eat inside it. Carnes, we'll leave at once and Leave our substitutes in possession of the cabin. Well, I trust, gentlemen, that things will come out all right and that you're in no danger." Major Trowbridge shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Well, let's hope so," he said. "It's a matter of duty to me, you know. Thank God I have no family to mourn if anything does go wrong. Neither is Corporal Askins. Well, good luck at any rate. Will you guide Carnes to the tent and return here so I can join him?" Huddled in the tiny concealed tent, Dr. Bird handed Carnes a haversack on a web strap. "This is a gas mask," he said. "Put it on your neck and keep it ready for instant use. I have one on, and one of us must wear a mask continually while we're here. We'll change every hour. If the gas used is lethane, as I suspect it is, we should be able to detect it before it gets too concentrated. But some other gas might be used, and we have to take no chances. Right, now look here." With the aid of a flashlight, he showed Carnes a piece of apparatus which had been set up in the tent. It consisted of 2 telescopic barrels, one fitted with an eyepiece and the other, which was at a wide angle to the first, with an objective glass. Between the two was a covered round disc from which projected a short tube fitted with a protecting lens. This tube was parallel to the telescopic barrel containing the objective lens. "This is a new thing that I've developed. It's getting its first practical test tonight," he said. "It's a gas detector. Works on the principle of a spectroscope with modifications. From this projector goes out a beam of invisible light, and the reflections are gathered and thrown through a prism of the eyepiece. While a spectroscope requires that the substance which it examines be incandescent and throw out visible light rays in order to show the typical spectral lines, this device catches the invisible ultraviolet on a fluorescent screen and analyzes it spectroscopically. Whoever has the mask on must continually search the sky with it and look for the 3 bright lines which characterize lethane, one at 230, one at 240, and the third at 670 on the illuminated scale. Look, if you see any bright lines in those regions or any other lines that are not continually present, you call for me at once. Right, I'll watch for the first hour." At the end of an hour, Dr. Bird removed his mask with a sigh of relief, and Carnes took his place at the spectroscope. For half an hour he moved the glass about, and then spoke in a guarded tone. "I don't see any of the lines you told me to look for," he said. "But in the southwest I get a wide band at 310. And 2 lines at about 520. Dr. Bird advanced toward the instrument, but before he reached it, Carnes gave out a cry. "Damn, there they are, Doctor." Dr. Bird sniffed the air. A faint sweetish odor became apparent, and he reached for his gas mask. Slowly his hands dropped, and Carnes grasped him and drew the mask over his face. Dr. Bird rallied slightly and feebly drew a bottle from his pocket and sniffed it. In another instant, he was shouldering Carnes aside and staring through the spectroscope. Carnes watched him for an instant, and then a low whirring noise attracted his attention, and he looked up. Silently, he caught the doctor's arm in a vice-like grip and pointed. Hovering above the cabin was a silvery globe, faintly luminous in the moonlight. From its top rose a faint cloud of vapor which circled around the globe and descended toward the earth. The globe hovered like a drone above the cabin, and Carnes barely stifled his emotions. The door of the cabin opened, and Major Trowbridge, walking stiffly and like a man in a dream, suddenly appeared. Slowly he advanced for 10 yards, and then stood motionless. The globe drone moved over him, and the bottom unfolded like a flower. 2 long arms shot silently down and grasped the motionless figure, and drew him up into the heart of the globe. The petals refolded, and silently as a dream, the globe shot upward and disappeared. "Damn, they lost no time taking him," commented Dr. Bird. "Come on, Carnes. Run for your life, or rather, for Trowbridge's life. No, you idiot. Leave your gas mask on. Look, I'll take the spectroscope. That's all we're going to need." Followed by the panting Carnes, Dr. Bird sped through the night along an almost invisible path. For half a mile he kept up his pace, until Carnes could feel his heart pounding as though it would burst his ribs. The pair then left the tree line and went into a glade a few acres in extent, and Dr. Bird paused and whistled softly. An answering whistle came from a few yards away, and a figure rose in the darkness as they approached. "Maynard," called Dr. Bird. Good enough, man. I was afraid you might not have kept your gas mask on." "My orders were to keep it on, sir," replied the lieutenant in muffled tones through his mask. "But my assistant did not obey orders. He passed out cold without any warning about 15 minutes ago." "Right, where's your ship?" "Right over here, sir." "Okay, we'll take off at once. Your craft is equipped with a bird silencer?" "Yes, sir." "Right, come on, Carnes. We're going to follow that globe. You take the front cockpit alone. Maynard, Carnes, and I will get in the rear with the spec and guide you. You can take off your gas mask at an elevation of 1,000 feet. You do have parachutes, don't you?" "Yep, in the rear, Doctor." "Okay, put one on, Carnes, and climb in. I've got to get this spec set up before it gets too high." The aircraft, equipped with the bird silencer, took the air noiselessly and rapidly gained elevation under the urging of the pilot. Dr. Bird clamped the gas-detecting spectroscope on the front of his cockpit and peered through it. "Right, southwest. About 1,000 more elevation," he directed. "Right," replied the pilot as he turned the nose of his plane in the indicated direction and began to climb. For an hour and a half, the plane flew noiselessly through the night. "Bald Mountain," said the pilot, pointing. "Canadian border's only a few miles away." "God, if they've crossed the border, we're sunk," replied the doctor. "The trail leads straight ahead." Part 2. For a few minutes they continued their flight toward the Canadian border, and then Dr. Bird spoke. "Right, swing south," he directed. "Drop 1,000 feet and come back." The pilot executed the maneuver, and Dr. Bird peered over the edge of the plane and directed the spectroscope toward the ground. "Okay, half a mile east," he said. "Then drop another 1,000. Carnes, get ready to jump when I give the word." "Oh, God," groaned Carnes as he fumbled for the ripcord of his parachute. "Suppose this thing doesn't open?" "Well, they'll slide you between two barn doors for a coffin and bury you that way," said Dr. Bird grimly. "You know your orders, Maynard?" "Yes, sir." "When you drop, I'm to land at the nearest town. It'll be Lowell. And get in touch with the commandant of the Portsmouth Navy Yard if possible. If I get him, I'm to tell him my location and wait for the arrival of reinforcements. If I fail to get him on the phone, I'm to deliver a sealed packet which I carry to the nearest United States Marshal. When reinforcements arrive, either from the Navy Yard or from the Marshal, I'm to guide them toward the spot where I dropped you, and remain, as nearly as I can judge, 2 miles away until I get a further signal or orders from you." "Okay, that's right. We'll be over the edge in another minute. You ready, Carnes?" "Oh, yeah, I'm ready, Doctor. If I have to risk my precious life in this contraption." "Good. Then jump." Side by side, Carnes and the doctor dropped toward the ground. The plane flew silently away into the night. Carnes found that the sensation of falling was not an unpleasant one as soon as he got accustomed to it. There was little sensation of motion, and it wasn't until a sharp whisper from Dr. Bird called it to his attention that he realized he was almost at the ground. He bent his legs as he'd been instructed, and landed without any great force. As he rose, he saw that Dr. Bird was already on his feet and was eagerly searching the ground for the spectroscope which he'd brought with him in the jump. "Right, fold up your parachute, Carnes, and we'll stow them under a rock where they can't be seen. We won't need to use them again." Carnes did so and deposited the silk bundle beside the doctor's, and they covered them with rocks until they'd be invisible from the air. "Now, follow me," said the doctor, as he strode carefully forward, stopping now and then to take a sight with the spectroscope. Carnes followed him as he made his way up a small hill which blocked the way. A hiss from Dr. Bird stopped him. The doctor had dropped flat on the ground, and Carnes, on all fours, crawled forward to join him. He smothered a cry as he looked over the crest of the hill. Before him, sitting in a hollow in the ground, was the huge globe drone which had spirited away Major Trowbridge. "Well, this is evidently their landing place," whispered Dr. Bird. "The next thing to find is their hiding place." He rose and started forward, but sank at once to the ground and dragged Carnes down with him. On the hill which formed the opposite side of the hollow, a line of light showed for an instant, as though a door had been opened. The light disappeared and then reappeared, and as they watched, it widened, and against an illuminated background, 4 men appeared, carrying a 5th. The door shut behind them, and they made their way slowly toward the waiting globe. They laid down their burden, and one of them turned a flashlight on the globe and opened its door to the side through which they hoisted their burden. They all entered the globe drone. The door closed. With a slight whirring sound, it rose in the air and moved rapidly toward the northeast. "Right, that's the place we're looking for," muttered Dr. Bird. "We'll go around this hollow and look for it. Now be careful where you step. They must have ventilation somewhere if the laboratory's underground." Followed by the Secret Service operative, the doctor made his way along the edge of the hollow. They didn't dare use a torch, and it was slow work feeling their way forward, inch by inch. When they'd reached a point above where the doctor thought the light had been, he paused. "Right there must be a ventilation shaft somewhere around here," he whispered, his mouth not an inch from Carnes' ear. "We've got to find it. It'd never do to try the door. If any of them are still here, it's sure to be guarded. Right, you go up on the hill for 5 yards and I'll go down. We'll move back and forth on a 200-yard front and work carefully. Just don't fall in whatever you do. We'll return to this point every time we pass it and report." The operative nodded and walked a few yards up the hill and made his way slowly forward. He went 100 yards as nearly as he could judge and then stepped 5 yards further up the hill and made his way back. As he passed the starting point, he approached, and Dr. Bird's figure rose up. "Any luck?" he whispered. Dr. Bird shook his head. "Well, we'll try again," he said. "I think it's probably beyond us, so you go up another 15 yards, and we'll do the same as before." Carnes nodded, and they moved silently away. 15 yards up the hill he went, and then paused. He stood on the crest of the hill, and before him was a steep, almost precipitous slope. He made his way along the edge for a few yards, and then paused. Faintly you could detect a murmur of voices. So inch by inch he crept forward, going over the ground underfoot. He paused and listened intently, and decided that the sound must be coming from the slope beneath him. A glance at his watch told him that he'd spent 10 minutes on this trip, and he made his way back to the meeting place. Dr. Bird was waiting for him, and in a low whisper, Carnes reported his discovery. The doctor then went back with him, and together they renewed the search. The slope of the hill was almost sheer, and Carnes looked dubiously over the edge. "Damn, I wish we'd brought those parachutes," he whispered to the doctor. "We could have taken the ropes off him, and he could have lowered me over the edge." Dr. Bird chuckled softly and tugged at his middle. Carnes watched him with astonishment in the dim light, but he understood when Dr. Bird thrust the end of a strong but light silk cord into his hands. He looped it under his arms, and the doctor, with whispered instructions, lowered him over the cliff. The doctor lowered him gently for a few feet, and then stopped in response to a jerk on the free end. A moment later, Carnes signaled to be drawn up, and was soon standing beside the doctor. "Right, that's the place all right," he whispered. "The whole cliff is covered with creepers, and there's a tree growing right close to it. If we anchor the cord there, I think we can slide down to a safe hold on the tree." Well, the tree did indeed stand near, and the silk cord was soon fastened. Carnes disappeared over the cliff, and in a few moments Dr. Bird slid down the cord to join him. he found the detective seated in a crotch of the tree, only a few feet from the face of the cliff. From the cliff came a pronounced murmur of voices. Dr. Bird drew in his breath in excitement and moved forward along the branch. He touched the stone, and after a moment of searching, he cautiously raised one corner of a painted canvas flap and peered into the cliff. He watched for a few seconds and then slid back and silently pulled Carnes towards him. Together the two men made their way forward to the cliff, and Dr. Bird raised the corner of the flap, and they peered into the hill. Before them was a cave fitted up as a cross between a laboratory and a hospital. Almost directly opposite them, and at the left of a door in the farther wall, was a ray machine of some sort. It was a puzzle to Carnes, and even to Dr. Bird. Although he could grasp the principle at a glance, he was at a loss to divine its use. From a set of coils attached to a generator was connected a tube of the Crookes tube type, with the rays from it gathered and thrown by a parabolic reflector onto the surface where a man's head would rest when he was seated in a white metal chair with rubber-insulated feet, which stood beneath it. An operating table occupied the other side of the room, while a gas cylinder and other common hospital apparatus stood around ready for use. Seated at a table which occupied the center of the room were three men. The sound of their voices rose from an indistinct murmur to audibility as the flap was raised, and the watchers could readily understand their words now. Two of them sat with their faces toward the main entrance, and the third man faced them. Carnes bit his lip as he looked at the man at the head of the table. He was twisted and misshapen in body, a grotesque dwarf with a hunched back, not over 4 feet in height. His massive head, sunken between his hunched shoulders, showed a tremendous dome of cranium and a brow wider and even higher than Dr. Bird's. The rest of his face was lined and drawn, as though by years of acute suffering. Sharp black eyes glared brightly from deep sunken caverns. The dwarf was entirely bald. Even the bushy eyebrows, which would be expected from his face, were missing. "They ought to be getting back," said the dwarf sharply. "If they get back at all," said one of the two figures facing him. "What do you mean?" growled the dwarf, his eyes glittering ominously. "They are return, all right. They know they'd better." "Well, they'll return if they can. But I tell you again, Slavatsky, I think it was a piece of foolishness to try to take 2 men in one night. Well, we got Bird all right, but he's getting late for a second one, and they had to bring Bird over 100 miles and then go nearly 300 more for Williams. The news about Bird may have been discovered and spread, and others may be looking for us. Even Carnes might have recovered." "Didn't he get a full dose of lethane?" "So Frick says, and Bird certainly had a full dose. But I can't help but feel uneasy. Our operations were going too nicely on schedule. God, you had to break it up and take on an extra case in the same night as a scheduled one. I'm telling you, I don't like it." "Well, I'm sorry that I did it, Carson. Only because the results were so poor. We'd planned on Williams for a month, and I wanted him. Bird was so easy that I couldn't resist it." "What did you get?" "Not as much menthium as would have come from an ordinary bookkeeper." "Well, I'll admit that Bird is a grossly overrated man. He must have relied on sheer luck in his work in the past, and there was nothing in his brain to show it above average. We barely got enough menthium to replace what we used in capturing him." "Damn, we ought to have taken Carnes and left Bird alone," snorted Carson. "Even a wooded-headed detective ought to have given us a better supply than Bird yielded." "Well, we're bound to meet with disappointments once in a while. I'd marked Bird down long ago as soon as I could get a chance at him." "Well, you got to run that show, Slavatsky. But I'm warning you, we're not going to let you pull off another one like it. I don't take any more crazy chances, even on your orders." The hunchback then rose to his feet, his eyes glittering ominously. "What do you mean, Carson?" he said slowly, his hands slipping behind him as he spoke. "Don't you try any of that rough stuff, Slavatsky," warned Carson sharply. "I can pull a gun as fast as you can, I'll do it if I have to.
Gentlemen,
protested the third man, rising. We're all too deep into this to quarrel. Sit down and let's talk this over. Yeah, Carson's just worried. What is there to be worried about? Grunted the dwarf as he slid back into his chair. Everything has gone nicely so far and no suspicion has been raised. Well, maybe it has, and then, again, maybe it hasn't, growled Carson. I think this bird episode tonight looks bad. In the first place, it came too opportunely and too easily. In the second place, Bird should have yielded more menthium. In the third place, hey, did you notice his hands? They weren't the type of hands to expect on a man of his type. Oh, nonsense. They were acid-stained, like a scientist should be. Well, acid stains can be put on. May all be alright, but I'm worried, I tell you. When we're talking about this matter, there's another thing I want cleared up.
What is it?
Well, I think, Slavatsky, that you're holding out on us. You're getting more than your share of the menthium. And again the dwarf leaped to his feet, but the peacemaker intervened.
Carson has a right to look at the records, Slavatsky, he said.
Well, I'm satisfied, but I'd like to look at them too.
Look, none of us have seen him for 2 months now.
The dwarf glared first at one and then the other.
All right,
he said shortly, and limped to a cabinet on the wall. He drew a key from his pocket and opened it and pulled out a leather-bound book.
Look all you please. I was supposed to get the most. It was my idea, after all.
Well, you were to get 1.5 shares, while Willis, Frank, and I got 1 share each, and the rest half a share, said Carson. I know how much has been given. It won't take me but a minute to check up. He bent over the book then, but Willis interrupted.
I just better put it away, Carson, he said.
Here come the rest, and we don't want them to know we suspect anything. He pointed toward a disc on the wall which had begun to glow. Slavatsky looked at it and grasped the book from Carson and replaced it in the cabinet. He moved over and started the generator, and the tube began to glow with a violet light. A noise came from the outside, and the door opened. 4 men entered, carrying a fifth, whom they propped up in the chair under the glowing tube.
Everything go all right?
Asked the dwarf eagerly.
Smooth as silk,
replied one of the 4.
Well, we get some results this time.
The dwarf bent over the ray apparatus and made some adjustments, and the head of the unconscious man was bathed with a violet glow. For 3 minutes, the flood of light poured on his head. Then the dwarf shut off the light, and Carson Willis lifted the figure and laid it on the operating table. The dwarf bent over the man and inserted the needle of a hypodermic syringe into the back of his neck at the base of the brain. The needle was an extremely long one, and Dr. Berg gasped as he saw 4 inches of shining steel buried into the brain of this unconscious man. Slowly, Slavatsky drew back the plunger of the syringe, and Dr. Berg could see it was being filled with an amber fluid. For 2 minutes this slow work continued, until a speck of red appeared in the glass syringe barrel.
7.5 cubic centimeters,
cried the dwarf in a tone of delight.
Damn,
cried Carson.
That's a record, isn't it? Oh no, we got 8 once. Now, hold him carefully while I return some of it.
Slavatsky slowly pressed home the plunger, and a portion of the amber fluid was returned to the patient's skull. Then he withdrew the needle and straightened up and held it toward the light.
6 centimeters net, he announced. I'll take him back, Frank. I'll give Carson and Willis their share now, and we'll take care of the rest of you when you return. Is the ship well stocked?
Enough for 2 or 3 more trips.
Well, in that case, I'll inject this whole lot. Better get going, Frank. It's pretty late.
The 4 men who'd brought the patient in stepped forward and lifted him from the table and dragged him out. Dr. Bird dropped the canvas screen and strained his ears. A faint whir told him that the globe drone had taken to the air. He slid back along the limb of the tree until he touched the rope and silently climbed over until he returned to the top of the hill. He then tried to call to Carnes, and the operative soon stood beside him on the ledge surmounting the cliff. What on earth were they doing?" asked Carnes in a whisper. "That was Professor Williams of Yale. They were depriving him of his memory. There'll be another amnesia case in the papers tomorrow. Listen, I haven't got time to explain their methods now, but we've got to act. Hey, you have a flashlight?" "Yeah, and my gun. Are we going to break in? Look, there are only 3 of them. I think we could handle the lot." "Yeah, but the others may return at any time. We want to bag the whole lot of them. They've done their damage for tonight. Look, you heard my orders to Lieutenant Maynard, didn't you?" "Yeah?" "He should be somewhere in these hills to the south with assistance of some sort. The signal to them is 3 long flashes, followed in turn by 3 short ones, then 3 more long. Go and find them and bring them here. When you get close, give me the same light signal, and don't try to break in unless I'm with you. I'm going to do some more recon and make sure there's no back entrance through which they can escape. Well, good luck, Carnes, and hurry while you can. There's no time to be lost." Part 3. The Secret Service operative stole away into the night, and Dr. Berg climbed back down the rope and took his place at the window. Willis lay on the operating table unconscious, while Slavatsky and Carson studied the now partially emptied syringe. "You gave him his full share, all right," Carson was saying. "Guess you're playing with us. Well, I'll take mine now." He lay down on the operating table, and the dwarf fitted an anesthesia cone over his face and opened the valve of the gas cylinder. Then he closed it and rolled the unconscious man on his face and deftly inserted the long needle. Instead of injecting a portion of the contents of the syringe as Dr. Bird had expected him to do, he drew back on the plunger for a minute and then took out the needle and held the syringe to the light. "Well, Mr. Carson," he said with a malignant glance at the unconscious figure, "that recovers the dose you got a couple of weeks ago while Willis watched me. I don't think you really need any menthium. Your brain's too active to suit me as it is." And he gave an evil chuckle and walked to the far side of the cave and opened a secret panel. He drew from a recess a flask and carefully emptied a portion of the contents of the syringe into it. He replaced the flask and closed the panel, and with another chuckle he limped over to a chair and threw himself down into it. For an hour he sat motionless, and Dr. Berg carefully worked his way back along the branch and climbed the rope and started for the hollow. A faint whirring noise attracted his attention, and he could see the faintly luminous globe drone in the distance, rapidly approaching. It came to a stop at the spot where it had previously landed, and 4 men got out. Instead of going toward the cave, they towed the globe, which floated a few inches from the earth, toward the side of the hill farthest from where the doctor stood. 3 of them held it, while the 4th went forward and bent over some controls on the ground. A creaking sound came through the night, and the men moved forward with the globe. Presently its movement stopped, and the men reappeared. Again came the creaking sound, and the globe faded out, as though a screen had been drawn in front of it. The 4 men then walked toward the door of the cave. Dr. Bird dropped flat on the ground and saw them pause a few yards below him on the hill, and again work some hidden controls. A glare of light showed for an instant, and they disappeared, and everything again went quiet. Dr. Bird debated the advisability of returning to the window, but decided against it and moved down the face of the hill. Inch by inch, he went over the ground, but found nothing. In the darkness, he could not locate the door, and he made his way around the back of the hill. The precipice loomed above him, and he swept it with his gaze, but he couldn't locate an opening in the darkness. He dared not use his flashlight. As he turned, he faced the east and noticed with a start of surprise that the sky was getting red. He glanced at his watch and realized that Carnes had been gone for nearly 3 hours. "God damn," he exclaimed in surprise. Time's gone faster than I realized. He ought to be back at any time now.
He mounted the highest point of the hill and sent 3 long flashes, followed in turn by 3 short, and then 3 more long, to the south, and watched eagerly for an answer. He waited 5 minutes and repeated the signal, but no answering flashes came from the empty hills. With a grunt which might have meant anything, he turned and made his way toward the opposite side of the hollow where the globe had disappeared. Here he met with more luck. He marked the location with extreme care, and he had not spent over 20 minutes feeling over the ground before his hand encountered a bit of metal. As he pulled on it, his eyes sought the side of the hill. The dawn had grown sufficiently bright for him to see the result of his actions. A portion of the hill folded back, and the faintly glowing ship became visible. With a muttered exclamation of triumph, he approached it. The globe was about 9 feet in diameter, and was without visible doors or windows. Around and around it the doctor went, searching for an entrance. The ship now rested solidly on the ground. Well, he failed to find what he was looking for, and his hands began to go over it, searching for an irregularity. He covered nearly half of it before his finger found a hidden button, so he pressed it. Silently a door in the side of the craft opened, and he advanced to enter.
"You, hands up," said a sharp voice behind him.
Dr. Bird froze in an instant, and the voice spoke again.
"Now, turn around."
Dr. Bird turned and looked full into the eye of a revolver held by the man the dwarf had addressed as Frink. Behind Frink stood the dwarf and 3 other men. As his eye fell on Dr. Bird, Frink turned momentarily pale and staggered back, the revolver wavering as he did so. In that instant, Dr. Bird made a lightning grab for his own weapon, but before he could draw it, Frink had recovered and the revolver was again steady.
"Dr. Bird?" gasped Slavatsky. "That's impossible."
"Get his gun, Harris," said Frink. One of the men stepped forward and dexterously removed the doctor's automatic and frisked him expertly to ensure himself that he had no other weapon concealed.
"Bring him to the cave,"
directed Slavatsky, who, though obviously still shaken, had just as obviously recovered enough to be a very dangerous man. 2 of the men grasped the doctor and led him along toward the entrance of the laboratory, which stood wide open in the gathering daylight. Frink paused long enough to shut the side of the hill and conceal the ship, and then followed the doctor. In the cave, the door was shut, and the doctor placed against the wall under the window through which he had peered earlier in the night. Slavatsky took his seat at the table, his malignant black eyes boring into the doctor. Carson and Willis sat on the edge of the operating table, evidently still partially under the effects of the anesthetic that had been administered to them.
"How did you get back here?"
demanded Slavatsky.
"You work it out,"
snapped Dr. Bird. The dwarf then rose threateningly.
"You speak respectfully to me, for I am the master of the world,"
he roared in an angry voice.
"Answer my questions when I speak, or means will be found to make you answer. Now, how did you get back here?"
Dr. Bird maintained a stubborn silence, his fierce eyes answering the dwarf's look for look, and his prominent chin jutting out a little more squarely. It was Carson who suddenly broke the silence.
"Hey, that's not the Bird we had here earlier,"
he cried as he staggered to his feet.
"What do you mean?"
demanded Slavatsky, whirling around on him.
"Look at his hands,"
replied Carson, pointing. Slavatsky looked at Dr. Bird's long, mobile fingers, and an evil leer came over his face.
"So then, Dr. Bird,"
he said slowly,
"you thought to match wits with Ivan Slavatsky, the greatest mind of all the ages. Well, for a time you fooled me when your double was operated on here, but not for long. I presume you thought that we had no way of detecting the substitution. You've discovered differently. Now, where's your friend, Mr. Carnes?" Didn't your men leave him in the cabin when you kidnapped me?" Slavatsky looked at Frink inquiringly. "Well, he stayed in the cabin, if he was in it when we got there," the leader of the kidnapping gang replied. "He got a full shot of lethane, and he's due to be asleep still. I don't know how this man recovered. God, I left him there myself." "You fool," shrieked Slavatsky. "You brought me a dummy whom I wasted my time in operating on. Was the other one a dummy too?" "I didn't enter the cabin." Slavatsky shrugged his shoulders. "If that's all the good the menthium I've injected has done you, I might as well have saved it. It doesn't matter, though. We have the one we wanted now. Well, Dr. Bird, it was very thoughtful of you to come here and offer your marvelous brain to strengthen mine. I have no doubt that you will yield even more menthium than Professor Williams did this evening, especially as I will extract your entire supply and reduce you to permanent idiocy. I will have no mercy on you as I have on the others I've operated on." Dr. Bird held strong, in spite of himself, at these ominous words. "You have the whip hand for the moment, Slavatsky, but my time may come, and if it does, I will remember your kindness. I saw your operation on Professor Williams this evening. I know your power. I also know that you stole the idea and the method from Zweigart of Vienna. I saw you inject the fluid you drew into Willis's brain. Shall I tell what else I saw?" There was a look of shock in the dwarf's eyes, just for a moment, but he recovered himself quickly. "Into the chair with him," he roared. 3 of the men grasped the doctor and forced him into the chair, and Slavatsky started the generator. The violet light bathed Dr. Bird's head, and he felt a stiffness and contraction of his neck muscles, and as he tried to shout out his knowledge of Slavatsky's treachery, he found that his vocal cords were paralyzed. Through a gathering haze, he could see Carson approaching with an anesthesia cone, and the sweet smell of lethane assailed his nostrils. He fought with all his force, but strong hands held him, and he felt himself slipping, and then falling into an immense void. His head slumped forward on his chest, and Slavatsky shut off the generator. "Now, on the table," he said. The 4 men picked up the Herculean frame of the unconscious doctor and hoisted him up on the table. Carson seized his head and bent it forward, and the dwarf took from a case a syringe with a 5-inch needle. He touched the point of it to the base of the doctor's brain. Part 4. "Wait, Slavatsky, look over there," cried Frink. With an exclamation of impatience, the dwarf turned and stared at a disc set on the wall of the cave. It was glowing brightly. With a quick move, he dropped the syringe and snapped a switch, plunging the whole cave into darkness. A tiny panel in the door opened to his touch, and he stared out into the light. "Soldiers," he gasped. "Quick, out the back way." As he spoke, there came a sound as of a heavy body falling at the back of the cave. Slavatsky turned the switch and flooded the cave with light once more. At the back of the cave stood Operative Carnes, an automatic pistol in his hand. "Open the main door," Carnes snapped. Slavatsky made a move toward the light, and Carnes' gun roared deafeningly in the confined space. The heavy bullet smashed into the wall an inch from the dwarf's hand, and he stared back. "Now open the main door," ordered Carnes once again. The men stared at one another for a moment, and the dwarf's eyes fell. "Open the door, Frink," he said. Frink moved over to a lever. He glanced back at Slavatsky, and a momentary gleam of intelligence passed between them. Frink raised his hand toward the lever, and Carnes' gun roared again, and Frink's arm fell limp from a smashed shoulder. "Now, Slavatsky," said Carnes sternly, Come over here. Slowly the dwarf approached. Now, turn around, said Carnes. He turned and felt the cold muzzle of Carnes' gun against the back of his neck. Now tell one of your men to open the door, said the detective. If he promptly obeys your order, you are safe. If he doesn't, you die. Slavatsky hesitated for a moment, but the cold muzzle of the automatic bored into the back of his neck, and when he spoke, it was in a quavering whine. Oh, open the door, Carson, he whimpered. There was a moment of pause. If that door isn't open by the time I count 3, said Carnes. As far as Slavatsky is concerned, it's just too bad. Well, I'll have 4 shots left, and I'm a dead shot at this range. 1. 2. His lips framed the word 3, and his fingers were tightening on the trigger when Carson jumped forward, pulled the lever on the wall, and the door swung open. Carnes shouted an order, and through the open door came half a dozen Marines, followed by an officer. Now, tie these men up, snapped Carnes. In almost an instant, the 6 men were securely bound, and Frink's bleeding shoulder was being skillfully treated by 2 of the Marines. Carnes then turned his attention to the unconscious doctor. He rolled him over on his back and began to chafe his hands. An officer in a naval uniform came through the door, and with a swift glance around, bent over Dr. Bird. He raised one of the doctor's eyelids and peered closely at his eye, and then sniffed at his breath. It's some anesthetic I don't know, he said. Well, I'll try a stimulant. He reached in his pocket for a hypodermic, but Carnes interrupted him. Earlier in the evening, Dr. Bird said they were using lethane, he said. Oh, that new gas the Chemical Warfare Service has discovered, said the surgeon. In that case, I guess it'll just have to wear off. I know of nothing that'll neutralize it. Without replying, Carnes began to feverishly search the pockets of the unconscious scientist. With an exclamation of triumph, he drew out a bottle and uncorked it. A strong smell of garlic penetrated the room, and he held the open bottle under Dr. Bird's nose. The doctor lay for a moment without movement, and then he coughed and sat up, half strangled with tears running down his face. Take that confounded bottle away, Carnes, he said. Do you want to strangle me? He sat up and looked around. Hey, what happened? He demanded. Oh, yeah, I remember now. That brute was about to operate on me. How did you get here? Never mind that, Doctor. Are you all right? I'm fine. Hey, how did you get here so quickly? Well, I was a little slow in locating Lieutenant Maynard and the Marines. When we got here, I was afraid that we couldn't find the door. So I took Maynard and a detail around to the back, and I went up to the top and slid down our cord and looked in the window. You were unconscious, and Slavatsky was bending over you with a needle in his hand. I was about to try a shot at him, when something called their attention to the men in front, and I squeezed through the window and dropped in on them. They didn't seem too glad to see me, but I overlooked that and insisted on inviting the rest of my friends in here to share in the party. And that's all. Carnes, said the doctor, you're probably lying like a trooper when you make out that you did nothing, but I'll get the truth out of you sooner or later. But for now, I've got to get back to work. Send for Lieutenant Maynard. One of the Marines went out to get him, and Dr. Bird stepped to the cabinet from which Slavatsky had taken his record book earlier in the evening and took out the leather-bound volume. He opened it and started to read when Lieutenant Maynard entered the cave. Hello, Maynard, said the doctor, looking up. Are the rest of the party on their way? Well, they'll be here in less than 2 hours, Doctor. Good enough. We'll have someone sent to guide them here. In the meantime, I'm going to study these records. Now keep the prisoners quiet. If they make a noise, gag them. I need to concentrate. So for an hour and a half, silence reigned in the cave. A stir was heard outside, and Admiral Clay, the President's personal physician, entered, leading a stout grey-haired man. Dr. Bird whistled when he saw them and leaped to his feet as another figure followed the Admiral. God, it's the President, gasped Carnes as the officers came to a salute and the Marines presented arms. The President nodded to his ex-guard, acknowledged the salute of the rest, and turned to Dr. Bird. "Have you met with success, Doctor?" he asked. "I have, Mr. President, or rather I hope that I have. But at the same time, well, I'd rather experiment on some other victim of their devilry than the one you've brought me. My decision that the one I've brought shall be the first to be experimented on, as you term it, is unalterable." Dr. Bird bowed and turned to the dwarf, who had been a sullen witness of what had gone on. "Slavatsky," he said slowly, "your game is up. I've witnessed one of your brain transfusions, and I know the method. I gather from your notes that the menthium you've hidden in that cabinet is still as potent as when it was first extracted from a living brain. But in this case, I'm going to draw it fresh from one of your gang. Some of the details of the operation are a little hazy to me, but those you will teach me. I'm going to restore this man to the condition he was in before you did your devil's work on him, and you'll direct my movements. Now, just what is the first step in removing the menthium from a brain?" Well, the dwarf maintained a stubborn silence. "You refuse to answer?" asked the doctor in feigned surprise. "I thought that you'd rather instruct me and have me try the operation first on other men. Well, since you prefer that I operate on you first, I'll be glad to do so." He stepped to the opposite wall, and in a few moments had opened the dwarf's hiding place and taken out a flask of menthium. "Carson," he said, "after you'd watched Slavatsky inject menthium into Willis, you took Lethane and expected him to inject menthium into your brain. Well, instead of doing so, he withdrew a portion from your brain and put it in this flask. I have reason to believe from his secret records that I found in the cabinet with this flask that he has done so regularly. Are you willing to instruct me while I remove the menthium from him?" "You dirty swine," shouted Carson. "I'll do anything to get even with him, but I've never performed the operation. Only Slavatsky and Willis have operated." "Well, will you help me, Willis?" asked Dr. Bird. "Yeah, I'll be glad to, Doctor. God, I'm sick of this business anyway. At first, Slavatsky just planned to give us abnormally keen brains, but lately he's been talking of setting himself up as Emperor of the world. God, I'm sick of it. I think I would have broken with him and told you all I know anyway." "Right, throw him into that chair," said Dr. Bird. Despite the howlings and strugglings of the dwarf, 3 of the Marines strapped him in the chair beneath the tube. The dwarf howled and frothed at the mouth and directed a final appeal for mercy to the President. "Spare me, President, spare me," he howled. "I'll put my brains at your service and make you the greatest mentality of all time. Together we can conquer and rule the whole world. I'll show you how to build hundreds of ships like mine." The President turned his back on the dwarf and spoke curtly. "Proceed with your experiments, Dr. Bird," he said. Slavatsky directed his appeals to the doctor, who peremptorily silenced him. "I told you a few hours ago, Slavatsky, that the time might come when I would remember your threats against me. I'll show you the same mercy now as you promised me then. Carnes, put a cone over his face." Despite the howls of the dwarf, the operative forced an anesthesia cone over his face, and Dr. Byrne turned to the valve of the Lethane cylinder. With Willis directing his movements, he turned on the ray for 3 minutes and removed the unconscious dwarf to the operating table. He took the long needle syringe from a case and sterilized it, and then turned to the President. "I'm about to operate," he said. "But before I do, I wish to explain to all just what I've learned and what I'm about to do. With the data, the decision of whether I shall proceed will rest with you and Admiral Clay. Have I your permission to do so?" The President nodded. "When I first read of these amnesia cases, I took them for coincidences, until you consulted me and gave me an opportunity to examine one of the victims. I found a small puncture at the base of the brain which I couldn't explain, and I began to dig into old records. Well, I knew, of course, of Zweigert of Vienna, and the extravagant claims he had put forward back in the day. He was far ahead of his time, but he he mixed up some profound scientific discoveries with mysticism and occultism until he was discredited. Nevertheless, he continued his experiments with the aid of his principal assistant, a man named Slavatsky. Zweigert's theory was that intellectuality, brainpower, intelligence, call it what you will, was the result of the presence of a fluid which he called menthium in the brain. He thought that it could be transferred from one person to another, and with the aid of Slavatsky, he experimented on himself. He removed the menthium from an unfortunate victim who was reduced to a state of imbecility, and Slavatsky injected the substance into Zweigert's brain. The experiment resulted in death, and Slavatsky was tried for murder. He was acquitted of intentional murder, but was imprisoned for a time for manslaughter. He was released when the war ended, and for a time I lost track of him. I found translations of both the records of the trials and of Zweigert's original reports. And the thing that attracted my attention was that the puncture I found in the victim corresponded exactly with the puncture described by Zweigert as the one he made in extracting the menthium. I asked the immigration authorities to check over their records, and they found that a man named Slavatsky, whose description corresponded with the ill-fated Zweigert's assistant, had entered the United States under Austria's quota about a year ago. The chain of evidence seemed complete to me, and it only remained to find the man who was systematically robbing brains. Well, if such a thing was really going on, I felt that my reputation would make me an attractive bait, and I secured a double, as you know, and placed him in a position where his kidnapping would be an easy matter. I was sure that the victims were being taken away by air, and that lethane was being used to reduce the neighborhood to a state of profound somnolence. So I hid myself near my double with a gas detector, which would find even minute traces of lethane in the air. Well, my fish rose to the lure, and came after the bait last night. When his ship arrived, I found a strange gas in the air, and followed the ship by the trail of the substance which it left behind. Carnes was with me. We got here in time to witness the extraction of the menthium from my friend, Professor Williams of Yale, and to see it injected into one of Slavatsky's gang. I sent Carnes for help and messed around until I was captured myself. Well, help arrived for me just in time. That's about all there is to tell. I'm now about to reverse the process and try and remove the stolen brains from the criminals and restore them to their rightful owners. Well, I never operated, and the result might be fatal. So, shall I proceed? The President and Admiral Clay consulted for a moment in hushed tones. "Go on with your experiments, Dr. Bird," said the President, "and we will hold you blameless for failure. You've worked so many miracles in the past. We have every confidence in you." Dr. Bird bowed in acknowledgement to the compliment and bent over the unconscious dwarf. With Willis directing every move, he inserted the needle and drew back slowly on the plunger. 23 1/2 cubic centimeters of amber fluid flowed into the syringe before a speck of blood appeared. "Enough!" cried Willis. Dr. Bird withdrew the syringe and motioned to Admiral Clay. The man the Admiral had brought in was placed in the chair and lethane administered. He was laid on the table, and, with a silent prayer, Dr. Bird inserted the needle and pressed the plunger. When 5 1/4 centimeters had flowed into the man's brains, he withdrew the needle and held the bottle which Carnes had used to revive him under the man's nose. The patient coughed a moment and sat up. "God, where am I?" he demanded. His gaze roved the cave and fell on the President. "Oh, hello, Robert," he exclaimed. "What's happened?" With a cry of joy, the President sprang forward and shook the hand of the man. "You all right, William?" he asked anxiously. "Do you feel perfectly normal?" "Of course I do. Neck feels a little stiff." "What you talking about? Why shouldn't I feel normal? God, how did I get here?" "Take him outside, Admiral, and explain it all to him," said the President. Admiral Clay led the puzzled man outside, and the President turned to Dr. Bird. "Doctor," he said, "I need not tell you that I again add my personal gratitude to the gratitude of a nation which would be yours, could the miracles you work be told of." If there's ever any way that can serve you, either personally or officially, don't hesitate to ask. Now the other victims will be brought here today. Will you be able to restore all of them? I will, Mr. President. From Slavatsky's records, I find that I'll have enough if I reduce all of his men to a state of imbecility, except Willis. Now, in view of his assistance, I propose to leave him with enough menthium to give him the intelligence of an ordinary schoolboy. I quite approve of that, said the President, as Willis humbly expressed his gratitude. Have you had time to make an examination of that ship of Slavatsky's yet? Well, I haven't. As soon as the work of restoration is completed, I'll go over to it. When I master the principles, I'll be glad to take them up with the Army-Navy General Board. Well, thank you, Doctor, said the President. He shook hands heartily and left the cave. Carnes then turned and looked at the Doctor. Now, will you answer a question, Doc? He asked. Ever since this case started, I've been wondering at your extraordinary powers. You've ordered the Army, the Navy, the Department of Justice, and everyone else around as though you were an absolute monarch. I know the President was behind you. What puzzles me is how he came to be so vitally interested in this case. Dr. Bird smiled quizzically at the detective. And even the Secret Service doesn't know everything, he said. Evidently you didn't recognize the man whose memory I restored. Besides being one of the most brilliant corporation executives in the country, he has another unique distinction. He happens to be the only brother of the President of the United States. Well, there you go, my dear friends. Another old-school sci-fi classic for your whatever day of the week. Thursday's entertainment, yeah, okay. So yeah, the podcast will be tomorrow night. Doing a story here on the main channel tonight. And it's another long one, so I hope you really enjoyed that. That was a bit of a roller coaster ride, wasn't it? Daring do, action adventure, and a bit of horror thrown in as well. Well, yeah, like I said, the podcast will be over on my other channel tomorrow night. Then I might be back here on Saturday as well. We'll wait and see. But for this evening, that is definitely all, my friends. So till next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.